Chapter 1. Cast out into the dust. The door slammed behind her with a crack that echoed through the ranch yard like a gunshot. Mara didn't look back. If she did, she feared her legs would buckle, and she'd fall to her knees right there in the dirt, begging for scraps of kindness she knew would never come. The voices of her in-laws still hissed in her ears. Useless bear, not fit for a rancher's wife. Each word clung to her like burrs on her skirt. The air was dry, the late afternoon sun bleeding red across the plains. Dust swirled around her boots as if the land itself were spitting her out. She walked until the ranch was just a shadow against the horizon, until her throat burned and her lungs scraped with each breath. She told herself she would not cry, not where they could see her. But once the prairie stretched out in its endless loneliness, the tears came hot and silent, dripping into the parched earth. By the time she reached town, the lamps in the saloon windows were already flickering to life. The piano player's tune spilled into the street, jaunty and cruel in its cheer. Wooden floors creaked as cowboys drifted in and out, their spurs jingling, their laughter rough. Mara kept her head low, clutching the faded shawl around her shoulders, though whispers followed her like a trail of smoke. "There she is, the McGraw girl," one woman muttered to another outside the mercantile. "Cast out, they say. Can't give her man no sons." A man leaned against a hitching post and spat, his gaze sliding over her with something between pity and hunger. Mara's chest tightened. She ducked into the shadow of the general store, sinking onto the step as if the wood might swallow her whole. She had nothing left, no husband, no home, no place. Only the weight of shame pressing heavier than the desert sun. She pressed her palms together to steady their trembling. Around her, life in town pulsed on. Cattle drivers slamming whiskey glasses on bar counters, a coyote's cry carrying from the hills, boots thudding across the boardwalk. The world kept moving, indifferent to the ruin of one cast-out woman. She thought of turning back, of throwing herself at the mercy of the family who had turned her away, but the memory of her husband's cold eyes steeled her spine. She would rather wander the desert itself than crawl back to a man who had already chosen his pride over her love. The saloon door swung open with a groan, spilling golden lamplight onto the street. Mara wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, straightening her shoulders though her heart still hammered with fear. Somewhere out here, she told herself through the ache, she had to find a reason to keep standing, to keep breathing. The night stretched before her, dusty and dangerous, and for the first time, she realized she was utterly, achingly alone. Chapter 2. The Cowboy's Gentle Eyes. The sun had dipped low, painting the horizon in bruised shades of orange and violet. Mara still sat on the wooden step outside the general store, her shawl clutched tight against the evening chill. The street had grown busier as ranch hands poured into town, their laughter booming over saloon music. Horses snorted at the hitching posts, stamping their hooves against the dusty boards. She felt like a ghost among them, invisible and yet exposed, as though every whisper and glance carried her shame. Her throat ached with thirst, but she dared not move. She feared if she rose, her knees would give way beneath the weight of her despair. That was when a shadow fell across her. A tall man paused at the edge of the boardwalk, the spurs on his boots clinking softly with his step. He carried himself with a quiet ease, not like the swaggering ranch hands or the sharp-eyed gamblers who crowded the saloon. His hat tipped low, but when he looked at her, his eyes caught hers, steady, unhurried, and startlingly kind. "You look parched," he said, his voice deep, touched with the roughness of a trail rider. Without waiting for her answer, he slid the canteen from his belt and held it out. Mara hesitated, her pride prickling. Too many times, men had offered her things with cruel laughter tucked behind their smiles. She studied him, ready to find mockery there. But his face was calm, sun-worn, with the creases of a man who had worked long days beneath endless skies. She reached out at last, her fingers brushing the cool metal. The water touched her lips, sweet and sharp, and she drank until she feared he might think her greedy. Pulling back, she whispered, "Thank you." He nodded once, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Name's Caleb. Caleb Turner. Got a ranch west of here, past the river." He shifted, leaning lightly against the post beside her, as if he had all the time in the world. "And you, miss?" Mara's throat tightened. Her name felt heavy, carrying the ashes of everything she had lost. "Mara," she said finally, "just Mara." He studied her for a long moment, not with the sharp curiosity of the gossips, but with a quiet respect that made her heart twist. She dropped her gaze, embarrassed by the sudden warmth rising in her cheeks. "You alone out here?" he asked gently. The question struck deep, though there was no judgment in his tone. She wanted to lie, to pretend she had someone waiting for her, but the truth pressed out in a small, brittle voice. "Yes." Caleb's jaw tightened, his eyes scanning the street where rowdy cowboys jostled one another, their laughter carrying over the piano's wild notes. "Town like this ain't kind to a woman alone," he said softly. "Best you don't linger here after dark." She gave a bitter laugh before she could stop herself. "And where should I go, Mr. Turner?" "Back to the house that slammed its door in my face." The words hung between them, raw and trembling. Caleb said nothing for a while, but his silence wasn't cruel. It was the silence of a man choosing his words with care. Finally, he tipped his hat back and met her gaze again. "Then maybe you come with me," he said simply. "Ain't much at my place but horses, dust, and a porch that creaks in the wind. But it's safe. Safer than this." Mara stared at him, her heart stumbling. She didn't know this man, didn't know him trust, but something in his eyes felt solid, like the earth after storm. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe there might be a corner of the world where she wasn't cast aside. The coyotes howled in the distance, and the night pressed closer. Slowly, she nodded, her voice no louder than the rustle of the prairie grass. "All right," she whispered. And just like that, the first fragile thread of hope wound itself around her broken heart. Chapter 3. A Home on the Range. The trail westward stretched long beneath the moonlight. Mara rode behind Caleb on his bay gelding, the steady rhythm of hooves drumming against the hard-packed earth. The night air was sharp, carrying the smell of sagebrush and the faint cry of coyotes from the hills. Her hands clutched the back of his coat, hesitant, as if she feared even holding on too tightly might break the fragile kindness he had offered her. By the time they reached his ranch, the first pale fingers of dawn were stretching across the sky. The house was modest, weathered wood, a sagging porch, smoke curling gently from a crooked chimney. Beyond, a corral of horses shifted and snorted, their silhouettes ghostly in the morning mist. It was no grand homestead like the one she had been cast from, yet something about its quiet strength made her chest ache. Caleb swung down from the saddle, then turned, offering his hand. She hesitated before taking it, her palms small and trembling against his callous grip. He steadied her gently, as though she were made of glass. "Welcome," he said simply, gesturing toward the house. "It ain't much, but it's honest, and it's safe." Inside, the floorboards creaked under her boots. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee grounds, and saddle leather. A plain table sat near the hearth, a few chairs worn smooth by years of use. The room was humble, but it was warm, and no one's eyes burned with judgment here. Mara lowered herself into a chair, her shawl falling loose from her shoulders. Caleb busied himself at the stove, setting water to boil, his movements unhurried but sure. She watched him in silence, the way his broad shoulders shifted beneath his shirt, the way he carried himself without boasting. "You can stay here as long as you need," he said, pouring coffee into a chipped mug and sliding it across the table to her. His gaze flickered up, steady but respectful. Don't owe me a thing. A person shouldn't be left out in the dust. Her fingers wrapped around the warm mug, though she barely lifted it. Shame still burned in her, heavy and unspoken. You don't understand, she murmured, eyes fixed on the steam. I'm not the kind of woman men want. Caleb leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. That right? Who told you that? My husband, his family, the whole town, likely. Her throat tightened as the words broke free. I can't bear children. And out here, that means I'm nothing. For a long moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Caleb's expression softened, though his jaw tightened with quiet anger. You're not nothing, he said, his voice low but certain. A woman's worth ain't measured in sons or daughters. Least not in my book. Her eyes lifted his then, wide and wet, searching for the jest she expected, but there was none, just the steady truth of his gaze, the kind that held her without chains, without judgment. Outside, the horses whinnied, the prairie wind rattled the porch boards, and for the first time in weeks, Mara felt a flicker of safety. She sipped the coffee, the bitterness grounding her, and allowed herself the smallest, most dangerous of luxuries, hope. Chapter 4, Shadows of the Past. The town simmered under a late afternoon sun, the sky the color of hammered copper. Caleb tied his bay at the rail and offered Mara his hand. In and out, he said softly. Flour, nails, and we're gone. They had almost made the mercantile when the saloon doors burst wide and laughter spilled out, sharp as broken glass. 3 men stepped into the street, boots raising little puffs of dust. The one in front wore a black hat and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Well, I'll be, he drawled, the McGraw girl, and a new keeper. Mara's breath snagged. Clay McGraw, her former husband, tipped his hat like a mockery of courtesy, his brother's fan behind him, mean-faced and idling for trouble. Caleb's body still beside her, not tight, just anchored. Afternoon, he said, voice cool as creek water. Step aside. Clay's gaze slid over Mara, slow and nasty. Here, tell your patchin'. Up what's broken, cowboy. She ain't worth feed or fire. The piano inside the saloon stumbled to a halt. Chairs scraped. Even the wind seemed to lean in. Mara tasted iron and bitterness. Her fingers found the edge of Caleb's sleeve and then fell away, ashamed of the need. Caleb shifted his coat with 2 fingers, not to show a gun, though one rode there, but of freer shoulders. You'll take that back, he said, calm as the horizon. Clay chuckled. Or what? You'll teach me manners. He stepped close enough that Mara caught his breath, whiskey and spite. Tell him, Mara. Tell him why I sent you packing. The shame that had hunted her rose like heat. She stared at the boards, at the nail heads glinting. Before the words could catch her, Caleb spoke. You sent away a good woman. That's what you did. It wasn't loud, but it carried. Something in the saloon changed. Men turned, watching. Clay's grin curdled. Boys, he said. The first brother lunged. Caleb met him with a short, brutal left, the crack of knuckles like a pistol snap. The man folded, spurs skittering. The second came swinging a bottle. Caleb stepped in, the glass shattering against the post, whiskey fanning the air. He caught the man's arm, twisted, and sent him stumbling across a table. Poker chips flew like hail. Clay rushed Caleb then, heavier, meaner. They hit the planks hard. Mara flinched at the thud of bodies, the scuffle of boots. Dust rose in a golden veil. Caleb fought like a rancher working a mad horse. No swagger, only control. Clay drove a fist into Caleb's ribs. Caleb grunted, turned his weight, and hammered 2 clean punches that took the color from Clay's face. Mara, Clay spat, blood stringing his lip. You'll crawl back. Caleb's hand closed on Clay's shirt front and slammed him against the hitching rail. The street held its breath. "You won't speak her name like that again," he said, low, steady. "Not here, not anywhere." For a heartbeat, only the squeal of a turning sign and the ragged pant of men. Then the barkeep's shotgun boomed its presence from the doorway. "Enough," he warned. "Take it off my boards." Caleb released Clay and stepped back. Clay swayed, hate burning where pride had been. He spat into the dust, gathered his brothers with a hiss curse, and stalked away under a sky already going purple at the edges. Sound returned in pieces. The piano picking up a cautious tune, the murmur of voices. Caleb's shoulders eased. He turned to Mara, breath shivering through him now that it was done. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, unable to speak. Her hands moved on their own, pulling a clean handkerchief from her pocket to wrap his bleeding knuckles. He winced, and she felt his pain in her own bones. "You didn't have to," she began. He met her eyes, the faintest smile there, rueful and warm. "I wasn't proving anything," he said. "Just telling the town the truth." "What truth?" she whispered. "That you belong where you're wanted." He tipped his hat, as if sealing a vow. "And you wanted with me." Out beyond the rooftops the prairie darkened. Coyotes calling to the first stars. Mara tied a knot around his hand. The cloth blotched red, and something inside her, tied in shame for so long, loosened at last. The saloon's lantern swung, painting them in gold and shadow, and in the hush between piano notes she heard it. The steady, unafraid beat of a life she might yet claim. Chapter 5, Ashes and Embers. The storm had broken, but its echoes lingered. Caleb sat at the edge of his bed, shoulders hunched, shirt half unbuttoned and stained with blood. Lamplight painted his skin in amber and shadow, throwing long lines across the room. Mara knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she dipped the cloth into the basin, wrung it out, and pressed it gently against the cut at his temple. He winced, but didn't pull away. "Hold still," she whispered, her voice soft but charged with something raw. She dabbed at his knuckles next, red and swollen from striking Clay. The scent of whiskey from the broken bottle still clung faintly to his skin. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the steady tick of the mantel clock and the faint whinny of horses outside. Mara's throat ached with words she'd swallowed too long. Finally, they tore free. "You shouldn't have done it," she said, not meeting his eyes. "Not for me. I'm not worth that fight." Caleb turned his head, slow and deliberate, until she had no choice but to look at him. His eyes burned, not with anger, but with a kind of unshakable certainty that made her pulse stumble. "Not worth it?" he said. "Mara, I'd fight every man from here to Kansas, if that's what it took to make you see what I see." Her breath caught, and the cloth slipped from her fingers. She sat back on her heels, shaking her head. "You don't understand. I can't give you what a wife should. Children, a family. You deserve more than an empty house." The words spilled from her like broken glass, sharp and desperate. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to let them fall. Caleb leaned forward, his voice low and steady, like the hush before dawn. "A home ain't measured by how many children run through it. It's measured by who's standing there when the sun goes down. And I'd rather come home to you than to a house full of anyone else." Her lips parted, but no sound came. The fire in the stove crackled, filling the silence with warmth. Caleb reached for her hand, rough palm against her trembling fingers, and held it as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She tried to speak again, but the strength broke inside her, and instead she leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his chest. His shirt smelled of sweat, blood, and the faint sweetness of horses, and beneath it beat a heart steady and sure. His arms came around her, strong yet gentle, pulling her close. "You're not broken, Mara," he murmured against her hair. Not to me. Her tears finally came, hot and unrestrained, soaking into the fabric of his shirt. And in that moment, with the lamplight flickering and the world outside hushed in shadow, she felt something ignite between them. Something stronger than shame, fiercer than fear. It was fragile still, but it was real. A fire catching at last, glowing steady in the ashes. Chapter 6. Love's Last Ride into Sunset. The church was small, whitewashed with weather by prairie winds, its steeple leaning just enough to show its years. Inside, the benches creaked with the weight of townsfolk who had gathered, not all from affection, some from curiosity, some from gossip, but all from respect for the man who had fought for her. Sunlight slanted through the narrow windows, striking motes of dust that drifted like gold in the air. Mara stood at the doorway, her shawl replaced by a simple dress of faded blue cotton. Her hands trembled as she smoothed the skirt, her heart pounding harder than any gunshot she had ever heard. She had not expected this day. Not after the door had been slammed in her face. Not after the cruel words that had haunted her every step. Yet here she was, chosen, wanted, and about to be claimed not as a burden, but as a wife. Caleb waited at the altar, tall and sure, his hat resting against the pew, his dark hair brushed neatly for once. His eyes found hers across the small room, and the noise of whispers fell away. There was only him, steady as the mountains beyond the plains. The preacher's words were plain, but to Mara they rang like the turning of the world. Caleb took her hand in his, rough and warm, his thumb brushing across her skin, as if to anchor her there. When the vows were spoken, his voice was low but unshakable. "I'll stand by her, come dust or fire." Her own voice trembled, but she forced it steady, tears bright in her eyes. "And I'll stand by him, even when the world says I cannot." When he kissed her, it wasn't the kiss of a man claiming possession. It was the kiss of a man making a promise. Gentle, yet firm, carrying the taste of dust and hope alike. Applause rose awkwardly, boots scuffing against the floor, but Mara barely heard it. Later, as the sun bled into the horizon, Caleb lifted her onto the saddle of his bay gelding and swung up behind her. The town faded behind them, the saloon's music drifting faint on the evening breeze. Ahead stretched the open land, rolling grass, the scent of sage, the long shadows of coyotes loping in the distance. Mara leaned back against him, his arm secure around her waist. For the first time in her life, the emptiness inside her no longer felt like a curse. It felt like space for laughter, for peace, for a love that had survived shame and fire. She tilted her head toward him, her voice soft but certain. "I never thought I'd be wanted again." Caleb bent, his words a vow against the crown of her hair. "You're wanted, Mara. You're mine. Always." The horse carried them west, hooves drumming a rhythm as the horizon burned gold. Together, they rode into the dying light, not as castaways, but as husband and wife. Two souls bound tighter than the dust and the wind, finding their forever beneath the wild west sky. The prairie stretched wide, painted in fire and gold as the sun sank toward the horizon. Dust swirled in the cooling wind, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant rain. Behind them, the town quieted. The faint wail of the saloon fiddle drifting on the air like a memory of all they had endured. Mara sat astride the bay, Caleb's arm firm around her waist as they rode side by side into the open land. His bruised knuckles were bandaged, her shawl drawn close against the wind. Together they had faced down the cruel words, the fists, the shame, and together they had come through, scarred but unbroken. Caleb slowed the horse at a rise, overlooking the plains. The last light bathed them in a glow like embers, and he turned to her, his eyes steady as the ground beneath their feet. "You know," he said softly, voice rough with dust and truth, "I didn't save you. You saved me. You gave me something worth fighting for." Her throat caught, but her lips curved in a trembling smile. And you gave me something I thought I'd lost forever, she whispered. A home. He leaned down, pressing his forehead to hers as the sky bled red and violet. The horse shifted beneath them, patient as if it, too, understood. Then let's ride it together, Caleb murmured. Mara closed her eyes, breathed deep the wild air, and for the first time since being cast out, felt wholly, fiercely alive. They turned west toward the burning horizon and rode on, two souls bound by love, stronger than dust, stronger than time.